Today's topic is how to cut super pollutants, which are such a big nuisance. Hello, everyone. Good to be with you once again. Today, we are very lucky to have with us Alan Miller, a longtime environmental activist who later on began to work for the International Finance Corporation, and which is where he retired from. Over to you, Alan.
Thank you so much, Subodh. And as former colleagues, it's great to be connecting in our post-World Bank lives. I'm going to talk about the thesis of this short book that I did with two colleagues called Cut Super Climate Pollutants. And the point of this book, I'll briefly describe, is really to focus on the importance of contributors to global warming that differ from carbon dioxide in one critical respect. They don't stay in the atmosphere for eons the way carbon dioxide does. This is critical because if we're going to reduce warming in the near term, as we talk about by, say, 2030, 2040, we're already, of course, experiencing very terrible heat extremes as I speak in some parts of the world.
Yes. And
consequently, we're worrying more and more, not about 50 years from now, 2100, which we used to talk about. We're worrying about 2023 and 2024. So the question that I looked at with my colleagues was, well, what is it we can do that will make a difference in the very near term? Okay. And the answer is a little different than what we're hearing, frankly, a lot in the media. As I was getting ready to meet with you, I was listening to a National Public Radio discussion in which they finished by saying, so what we just need to do is reduce burning fossil fuels, and that will reduce warming. Unfortunately, it is not that simple. The reason is because carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for a very, very long time, really centuries. It takes an extremely long time to reduce carbon dioxide and make any difference. There's a second, more challenging issue and reason for what we say in our book that has gotten even less recognition, unfortunately, although is very widely scientifically endorsed. And that is, as you may know, Subodh, from your prior work, burning coal produces not only carbon dioxide, but sulfates.
Yes.
And the dirtier the coal, the more sulfates.
Yes.
And there are countries, particularly India and in the past China, less as recently in China, they've cleaned up quite a bit. But a lot of the sulfates coming from burning coal are light colored. And consequently, they actually reflect sunlight.
Yeah.
And the result of that is that those sulfates, while they don't stay in the air very long, only days and maybe weeks, while they're in the air, they are actually counteracting some of the warming by reflecting sunlight. They are sources of cooling.
Okay.
This is somewhat contrary to everything we are hearing.
Yes, I understand.
And yet, it's extremely important because what it means is that in the short term, as we convince countries like India and China to reduce, and they are the by far largest sources of coal burning now. US has dramatically reduced our coal consumption. They will be reducing CO2 very slowly, but they will be quickly reducing the sulfates. And the consequence is that for the next 5, 10, 12 years, there will be no net reduction in warming from reducing coal combustion. And this is so contrary to much of what is being said every day in the media, how to address climate change. Now, I want to emphasize something here.
Yeah.
Because it can easily be thought, well then, there's no point in reducing fossil fuels, which is not what I'm saying, not what we say in our book. We do need to reduce fossil fuels. However, if we want to reduce warming this year, next year, in the next 10 years, we can only do it by reducing these so-called super climate pollutants that have shorter lifetimes in the atmosphere and do not also reduce light-colored sulfates.
Okay.
In our little book, we focus on several of these so-called super or short-lived climate pollutants. And the one that has been getting the most attention and where some progress is being made is methane or natural gas.
Yes.
So there is a methane pledge, which Climate Ambassador Kerry helped bring about a couple of years ago. There are now over 130 countries that have made that pledge to gradually reduce their methane. But so far, unfortunately, China and Russia, two of the largest sources of methane, have not. Yeah. China has kind of informally said they would be reducing their methane, but they have not committed to the pledge.
And methane is 4 times as bad as carbon dioxide, right? That's how I remember it.
So this is another point which requires just a little bit of science. So when we talk about the difference between greenhouse gases, there's a very important metric that you have to ask, which is what period of time are we comparing them?
Okay.
And very frequently, because it was the basis for many climate models, the original climate models going back to the 80s were almost all, because of data limitations, making their projections over 100 years.
Yes.
So typically, when you see a metric for the relative impact of a greenhouse pollutant like methane, it almost always is erroneously, or I shouldn't say erroneously, it is compared and contrasted with carbon dioxide over 100 years.
Right.
However, if what you're interested in is not 100 years, but the next 10 or 20, you have to use a different metric. You have to say, oh, but methane only lasts in the air for about, on average, 12 years.
Right.
So the typical comparison that you will find if you look online is that methane is often said to be 24 times CO2.
Yeah, 24, not 4.
That, however, is a huge underestimate when you're talking about 10 or even 20 years.
Okay.
Because a lot of that impact of methane is gone after 20 years.
Yeah.
It disappears from the atmosphere. It's a very potent gas.
Yes.
So it's still 24 times.
Yeah.
On the basis of 100 years.
Yeah.
But here's the kicker. When you say, oh, how much is methane over 20 years?
Yeah.
Compared with CO2? And the answer is 84 times.
Wow. Okay. I get it.
So reducing methane is one of the most important things that we can do. Now, there's a couple of very recent things to be talking about when it comes to methane that your listeners may relate to. The first is that in order to reduce methane, a number of progressive cities such as New York, San Francisco, have been proposing bans on the inclusion of gas stoves in new buildings.
Yeah.
And this has engendered a huge controversy.
Right.
It's become very political.
Yeah.
And there actually are states, such as Arizona, that pass laws banning cities from restricting natural gas in new construction because Phoenix was going to do it.
Yeah.
And so, and I have to admit, some of my otherwise very environmentally oriented friends, when I'm in their home and I see a gas stove they get very defensive and they say, I love my gas stove.
Right. Okay.
Now, personally, when I had my kitchen renovated a few years ago, we didn't have a gas hookup, and we got the new version of an electric stove, which is called induction.
Yes.
And you have to have metal bottomed pots and pans for it to work, but we love it.
Okay. You love your induction?
So we love our induction, and I feel a little greener because of it.
Okay.
So the other issue that is very recent, and which is in some ways more politically difficult, is what's happened in California. And this is ironically in part a function of extreme temperatures. Southern California, parts of mid-California in the valley have had some of the very hot temperatures we're experiencing across the United States, as in Death Valley, right? Setting absolute temperature records. Well, the consequence is, what are people doing? They're turning on their air conditioners.
Right.
And there actually has been, in California last year and approaching this year, fears that there will be power blackouts.
Right.
And one of the answers to this has been that California, progressive democratic state that it is, had a plan to shut down a number of its gas power plants.
Right.
They have reversed that. Why? Because gas has become the marginal source for peak periods.
Yes.
And politically, one of the most threatening things that you can tell people is you're going to have a blackout when you need your air conditioning.
Right. You cannot do it.
So even a progressive democratic state like California has had to reverse and postpone closing their natural gas plants.
Yeah.
And the natural gas plants, unfortunately, are large sources of methane leakage and emissions. And frankly, gas stoves are typically really bad. They typically are not very tightly controlled. And the reason that they have been increasingly regulated is only secondarily because of climate change. It's also because gas leakage inside your home, especially if you're in an apartment without a very good air filtration, is a very bad health hazard.
Okay.
So methane is the #1 issue.
Right.
And it's, unfortunately, we're now getting better at reducing certain methane leaks. So it turns out that focusing on gas wells and pipelines is, as you would appreciate, Subodh, very economic.
Yeah, it is. Definitely.
Because if you're leaking gas, you're getting nothing.
Better fix it, right?
You want to fix it.
Right.
And so we now have satellite and other technology, which is making it easier and much more effective to find these leaks and fix them.
Okay.
There also, unfortunately, is a lot of methane leakage from abandoned coal mines.
Okay.
And that is still an issue that we're only gradually coming to terms with, because many of these abandoned coal mines are in places where the regulation is not very good, the systems in place and governance are not very good, but they're, again, and the economics are not quite as obvious as they are with a pipeline or with a gas well.
So it's really not it's really the leakages that are a key issue. Is the leakages. Right?
There are other sources of methane that vary from country to country, including a lot is, in many countries, the biggest source, if you don't have, as the US is the biggest exporter, by the way, now, of natural gas in the world.
Yeah.
As we proclaim ourselves the climate champions,
right.
we are also a huge source of natural gas distribution. But in many countries, the largest sources of methane are actually from agriculture,
Yeah,
wet rice production,
yeah,
and livestock.
yeah,
So ruminants,
yeah,
cows and sheep,
yeah,
are actually, because of incomplete digestion,
right.
putting natural gas out both ends.
Yes, understood.
You
Yeah.
know,
I think that's
uh,
pretty well known, right? The
yeah.
cow. Yeah.
There was a wonderful Burger King commercial a few years ago that I occasionally play on YouTube, in which there's a 10-year-old who sings about cow burps and farts.
Yeah. Right. Okay. So a very serious issue. And it's really not in the public image at all, in the public discussion, that this is something that in the short run, we need to tackle this.
Yeah, and it's one of the reasons that people promote eating less meat
Yes.
as a way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, because it's the full life cycle of a cow.
Yeah.
Is not only its emissions, it's the corn
Yeah.
that is grown,
Yeah.
with the fertilizers that are used to grow the corn,
Yeah.
the cold storage for the cow after it's been slaughtered. So it's a very methane and CO2 intensive
Okay.
business.
All right. Yeah, I get it. All right. Good.
So that's number one.
Yeah.
Number two is much less publicly discussed, but it is a chemical still widely used as a refrigerant called hydrofluorocarbons,
Yeah.
or typically referred to by its acronym, which is HFC.
Right.
And HFCs, ironically, were introduced as substitutes for ozone depleting chemicals.
Right. I remember that those days. Yeah.
Yeah. And the unfortunate consequence, however, is that while these chemicals don't cause ozone depletion, they are very potent greenhouse gases. And they, like methane, have shorter atmospheric lifetimes. So they too can be replaced. And the good thing on that topic is that a few years ago, in 2016, there was an international agreement reached, somewhat confusingly when I teach, not through the climate convention, even though it's a greenhouse gas.
Yeah.
It was actually an agreement to the Montreal Protocol for the protection of the ozone layer.
Okay. Yeah. It's for coming.
But
yeah.
These international agreements are their own worlds.
Yeah.
And it just turned out that it was easier to get an agreement to protect, to actually a climate agreement under the Montreal Protocol.
Right.
And the connection being, it was a chemical, a gas actually, introduced because of an agreement under the Montreal Protocol. So
right.
A little bit of an added complexity.
Yeah.
But the point is, this agreement calls for a gradual reduction of 80-some%, I think it's 85%, over the next decade. And there's a lot of evidence that that could be substantially accelerated.
Mm-hmm.
And that incentives could be provided to developing countries to accelerate their replacement of this refrigerant.
Yeah. So is this used in refrigerators and air conditioners?
Yes. Yeah. It's tricky because some of the substitutes are flammable or mildly flammable. And in many countries, depending on how good the regulations are, flammability is a legitimate concern.
Right.
But there are pretty much now, for almost all uses of these HFCs, pretty good substitutes. And in some countries, they are actually using remarkably carbon dioxide as a natural refrigerant.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more and more research that is being done on coolants and cooling.
Yeah.
And I might just briefly mention that this year, in Dubai at the next climate meetings, referred to as COP28 conference, the 28th conference of the parties in Dubai, one of the hotter countries and places in the planet, there will in fact be a cooling day, and a major report is being done by the United Nations that will be released there. And I've been proud to be a contributing author, so that's why I'm
Wonderful.
pleased to bring it up.
Yeah, so what will they say?
Well, they're going to say that a lot more effort needs to go into it.
Okay.
But there are some pretty interesting developments in the works. For example, 2 years ago, year and a half ago, there was an initiative jointly done, sponsored by the India Environment Ministry and an NGO from the United States that used to be called the Rocky Mountain Institute, started by Henry Lovins. I think you know it.
Everybody knows it, right?
Now it goes by its acronym, RMI.
Right.
And they together did something called the Global Cooling Prize.
Yeah.
And that resulted in a couple of very interesting winners who had concepts for a 5-fold reduction in the total global warming impact of their technology. Those are not yet commercial, but there's a lot of work being done. And I think that the focus that will be brought, you know, there is no SDG for cooling.
No.
Cooling affects so many different SDGs, right?
Yeah.
Cooling is energy demand.
Yeah.
And by the way, the power demand for cooling, something I learned from the report that's coming in the fall, is growing faster than additions of solar and wind power.
Definitely. You know, this is, I think everybody, you know, you do read newspaper articles on improved ACs and improved refrigeration. And everybody knows that if you don't do it, there's hell to pay, because as incomes rise, people who weren't able to afford it, they will afford it. And you can see that in every developing country, that the need for heating and cooling, especially cooling, is rising. And the growth rate for electricity demand there is faster than for anything else.
It's absolutely, yeah.
And if you have more hot summers, you can't really just meet it by solar panels on your roof easily. So it is an issue overall of the electricity demand.
The impact between cooling, electricity demand, then more greenhouse gases. So there is this cycle that is feeding, unfortunately, more warming.
Yeah.
You know, more heat, more air conditioning, more power, more warming. And that's a cycle, unfortunately, that we're really locked into right now.
Yeah, true. The more air conditioning you use, it generates stuff that increases heat. So you need, you have to bend the curve. There's just no other way around. There's just no other way.
And as you know, Subodh, I mean, cooling is relevant for so many different sectors, right? It's relevant for agriculture to store food. We lose in many countries 50% of all the food that's produced.
No, you need that.
There's no cold chain. There's no transport. In Nigeria, the shipping distance from the main agriculture areas to Lagos, given very, very bad infrastructure, is such that farmers can't get many produce to Lagos, to the market.
True.
And this is true in many parts of India as well.
Sure, it is the truth. You know, even when you can, in the US, we are all importing stuff from Canada and Mexico.
Right.
It comes quickly, but it still comes, you know, it's a long travel.
That's right.
It has to be.
That's right.
And
then as we saw with COVID and the vaccines, cold storage is essential.
Yeah, it's essential.
With some vaccines, you have to have, 70 below 0 centigrade.
Right.
And the distribution of vaccines is still an incredibly inadequate issue in many parts of the world.
Yeah. So So all this cooling is going to lead to rising demand.
Absolutely.
Yeah, nobody is, similarly in housing, if you're going to build more homes, the cement is a great emitter. So I think these are pretty now increasingly known. There's no
Yes.
clear solutions. This is the problem. The knowledge is there. People no longer just talk about, oh, put windmills and solar, because you have to go sector by sector and figure it out as to how you're going to do it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. Okay, let's go ahead. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I have much less to say about the other two climate pollutants in the book that we described. One is black carbon.
Yeah.
And the primary sources of black carbon are from cook stoves.
Right.
And poorly controlled diesel generators and trucks.
Yeah.
And black carbon is much more of a geographically specific issue. It doesn't distribute around the carbon dioxide, methane distribute very rapidly around the atmosphere. Black carbon does not. It tends to disproportionately impact at the poles. And but again, it can be, because it's short-lived, as we hopefully are making progress in reducing cook stoves, which is itself a major development challenge, as we know from our World Bank days.
Yes.
Then reducing black carbon is one of the other short-term ways of reducing warming.
Yeah.
And so just as sulfates are light-colored,
yeah,
black carbon is black
and absorbs.
And absorbs.
Right.
And the last one of the short-lived pollutants that we talk about is tropospheric ozone. And
I have never heard of it, so please tell me.
So ozone in the upper atmosphere is what protects us from ultraviolet radiation.
True.
And ozone depletion is basically an issue of the upper troposphere, lower stratosphere, 6 to 10 miles above the Earth.
Right.
But it also turns out that we have bad ozone days caused by a combination of sunlight and pollutants, particularly from automobile emissions. And tropospheric ozone, in part, is also a function of methane in the atmosphere, so there's an interaction. And tropospheric ozone also turns out to be a very potent, short-lived greenhouse gas.
Yeah.
So all of which adds up to saying, again, to come back to my central point, if we want to reduce warming in the next 5, 10, 15 years, we're not, unfortunately, going to be able to do it through reducing fossil fuels, particularly through coal and oil. Even though we do need to do that, just to emphasize that point, but to reduce warming and avoid these extreme heat records that we're now setting almost every day, we're going to have more progress reducing these so-called super climate pollutants. Okay. Methane, HFCs, black carbon, and tropospheric ozone.
So as I hear you, what you're saying is we have been on a one-track strategy. We need to be on a dual-track strategy. We need to achieve some things in the short run, and that is a different way than what we have been talking about based on 100-year models or holding things to 2050. But the new point you are making, which I think is not yet very clear to everyone, and certainly was not clear to me, so thank you, is that there is going to be a second track. And that second track has to be focused on getting things done which have an impact in the next 10 to 15 years.
Yes.
We need to worry about 2050 for sure. We need to worry about 2100 for sure. But we just cannot focus on 2050 and 2100. We need to focus on 2030, 2040, and even as you are saying, 2025. Right?
Exactly.
It's not like, we are leaving behind a dirty earth for our grandchildren. We are leaving it. We are going to be living in it. We are going to be living in it in the next few years.
Yeah,
That's certainly a good point, Alan. I'm really happy to have heard it from you.
yeah, and I can relate to what you just said very personally, because I have a daughter who's now 30, and in the past, maybe 10 years ago, I would typically think about my work on climate change as being for her lifetime. And I can tell you, I think of it increasingly. I like to jog.
Yeah.
I like to hike.
Yeah.
And I myself now find if I want to jog, I have to go out very early in the morning.
True. True.
Or I'm risking my health.
True. Yeah, okay. So the short run is as important now as the long run. They are actually two separate tracks.
Yes.
It's not a question. We got to survive the next few years if we are going to do better in the long run. So we have to have both. It's not like you are not saying, look, don't think about 2050. Yes, you have to think about 2050.
Absolutely.
But please don't forget the next 5 to 10, 15 years. That is the second channel that we must get action on. I really think that's something that I've learned today. It was never so clear in my head that this is it. I mean, I knew black carbon, I knew, the effects of methane and so on, but it always seemed to fit in the same long-term horizon. But it's not the long-term horizon, it's the short to medium-term horizon.
That's right.
Equally important if we are going to actually not have chaos in the next 5 to 10 years.
That's right.
Okay, wonderful. Anything else you would like to add?
No, I guess just to also emphasize that we talked some as well about the status of air conditioning and cooling and how it is becoming this increasingly important issue. And I do think that is going to get more and more attention. Coming from the IFC as I did, I worked quite a bit on emerging technologies using climate finance. We financed fuel cells. We financed concentrating solar power plants.
Yes.
We did all kinds of geothermal projects.
Right.
And a really positive development of recent vintage has been an incredible increase in the private funding flowing into many climate-related technologies.
Okay.
So I think the estimate is on the order of easily several $100 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act.
Yes.
When you actually say, but globally, from all sources, including all the private investment,
yeah,
it's in the trillions of dollars. Okay. Trillions.
And we need that much, the billions aren't going to cut it anymore. It's just not.
And so we're now seeing people willing to invest in things that are pretty futuristic, like green hydrogen.
Yeah.
Direct air capture.
Yeah.
These are things that are still, frankly, pretty far off as commercial products and services. But the money is starting to flow. And I do think, in contrast, that air conditioning has not, and cooling more generally, since it's not just air conditioning, it's the whole business, cold storage and everything. I do think the money is just starting to flow into that, because it was much slower to be recognized as so important for climate change, because we thought, oh, cooling we'll need in 50 years.
Right.
And now we know, we need a lot of cooling now. So
I mean, it's obvious. Let's not discuss it. It's well known. We understand that this is not a big deal. But thank you for this very clear exposition of
You're very welcome,
tracks that are needed. And I think maybe you should just not say cut super pollutants now. just say, in a more positive approach, say, adopt the two-track approach.
I appreciate that recommendation, and
Yeah.
yes,
Because people like to know how to solve it and, cut this, cut that. I'm a salesman of ideas. Other people's ideas included. It's what I hear from you is not cut super pollutants. That's the way to do it. But what you are really saying is that we need a two-track approach, a short-term and a long-term. Then people say, what the heck do you mean by short-term? You say, this we achieve by cutting super pollutants. So, anyway, that's just a talk between us. And I'm glad that we have had this talk. It's very useful, and at least I enjoyed it a lot. So thank you. Let's say bye to the viewers, and we'll catch up with you, and maybe after you presented your paper in Dubai.
Thank you.
Yeah, and then we'll
pleasure.
see what you are thinking at that time. It's not so far, maybe 3 months. We'll be back to you, and we'll say, well, tell us what you did.
And then I'll hold up this
it's
report.
like, what I did in my summer holiday.
Absolutely.
All right. All right, Alan, thank you so much. Let's stop the recording. Bye, everybody. It was really great to have Alan, and we'll see what he brings to us in 3 to 4 months. Okay, bye, everybody.